Welcome to Eerie Echoes. Tonight we open the archives of Appalachia. Not legends, not campfire tales, but true horrors documented in newspapers, police files, and historical records. Every story you are about to hear really happened. These aren't inventions or ghost stories spun for entertainment. These are accounts that scarred families, haunted towns, and left traces still found in the official record. From vanishings that remain unsolved to murders that shattered the safety of the Appalachian Trail. From glowing lights no science can fully explain to voices of the dead crying out for justice. These are not myths. These are the true shadows of the mountains. And our first story proves it. In 1897, a young woman's death in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, was written off as natural, until her spirit returned to name her killer. It is the only case in American legal history where the testimony of a ghost helped convict a murderer. This is the tale of Zona Heastershoe, remembered forever as the Greenbrier Ghost. There are places in Appalachia where silence feels alive, where valleys seem to hold their breath and mountains seem to watch. In the winter of 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, one such silence was broken by a death that should have faded into the ground, but instead spilled over into legend. Her name was Zona Heastershoe, and though her body was laid to rest, her voice refused to remain buried. Zona was 23 years old, a young woman known for her warmth and steady nature, close to her mother, Mary Jane. She lived in the rhythm of the county's hills, in a place where life was often hard but familiar. In October of 1896, change arrived in the form of a new blacksmith, a man who introduced himself as Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe. He was a man of confidence, strong arms from work at the forge and a restless energy about him. He had come to Greenbrier to start over, or so he said. For Zona there was perhaps a spark of excitement in his attention, and within weeks their courtship turned into marriage. Not everyone was convinced. Mary Jane Heaster distrusted her new son-in-law from the beginning. Rumors of Trout's past marriages swirled. One wife divorced him, claiming cruelty. Another died under circumstances never fully explained. Mary Jane sensed something dark beneath his charm, but Zona pressed on. In those mountains where gossip often passed like wind through the trees, suspicion could be both everything and nothing. Just 3 months after the wedding, on a cold day in January 1897, a neighbor boy sent on an errand entered the Shoe home. Inside, he found Zona lying at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes open, her body still. Shocked, he ran for help. When the doctor arrived, Trout had already carried her upstairs and dressed her in a high-necked gown with a stiff collar, tying a scarf tightly around her throat. He kept watch over the body, weeping loudly whenever the doctor came too near. Dr. George Knapp made only a cursory examination. He noted faint marks on the neck, but, perhaps overwhelmed by Trout's grief or his insistence, declared the cause of death to be everlasting faint. Later, he quietly changed the record to complications from childbirth. With that, the county accepted the verdict. Zona was buried the very next day, but Mary Jane could not let go. The haste, the scarf around the neck, the husband's strange possessiveness, it all gnawed at her. She believed her daughter had been murdered. Nights passed in grief until she claimed something more than grief began to visit her. Zona came to her, she said, not in dreams but in waking visions. The spirit appeared 4 nights in a row. Each time it revealed more. She said Zona described how her husband, in a rage, had crushed her throat, snapped her neck. On the last night, the ghost turned her head all the way around to show the broken bones. Mary Jane carried her story to the county prosecutor, John Alfred Preston. At first he listened with skepticism. Ghost stories did not belong in legal matters. But Mary Jane did not rely only on the supernatural. She pressed him with earthly evidence, the rushed burial, the concealment of the neck, the suspicious history of the husband. Whether it was her persistence, the weight of rumors, or perhaps a flicker of doubt in Preston's mind, he relented. He ordered the body exhumed. On February 22, 1897, Zona's remains were taken from the earth. In a nearby schoolhouse, 3 doctors conducted an autopsy that lasted 3 hours. What they found was unmistakable. Her neck was broken between the first and second vertebrae. The windpipe was crushed, ligaments torn, bruises encircled the throat. Everything Mary Jane had claimed, everything the ghost had whispered, was confirmed in cold, undeniable evidence. Trout Shue was arrested. His trial drew the community in, the courthouse filled with faces caught between fascination and dread. The prosecution built its case on the physical findings and Shue's suspicious behavior. The defense, desperate, tried to turn the spotlight on Mary Jane, pushing her to recount her ghostly visions, hoping to make her appear unstable. But she did not falter. Calmly, steadily, she repeated her story. Whether the jury believed in spirits or not, the facts were now beyond denial. After just an hour of deliberation, they returned with a verdict, guilty of murder. Shue was sentenced to life in prison, where he died 3 years later. Zona's grave stands quietly in Greenbrier County. Years later, a marker was placed with words that still astonish visitors, that her death was a mystery until she returned to tell her mother the truth. It remains the only case in American legal history where the voice of a ghost, or at least the conviction born from one, played a decisive role in court. Some say Mary Jane truly saw her daughter. Others believe grief and intuition drove her to frame the story in a way the community would listen. Whichever it was, the result was the same. The silence of injustice was broken. And so the Greenbrier Ghost lingers in Appalachian lore, not only a tale of murder, but of a mother's refusal to let her child's story be buried. In these mountains where faith and fear walk hand in hand, the line between the living and the dead has always been thin. Zona's case proved it could even reach into a courtroom. Justice, however strange, was served here. But not every Appalachian story bends toward justice. Some end only in vanishing in the cruel hush of the wilderness. Just 70 years later, in the Smoky Mountains along the Appalachian Trail, a little boy would step behind a bush to play a prank and simply never return. His name was Dennis Martin, and his disappearance remains one of the most chilling mysteries of the mountains. And if you want to keep walking into these shadows with me, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may be even harder to shake off once you've heard it. It was Father's Day weekend in 1969. A family gathered for a camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains, the sun bright on the high ridges, the boys laughing in the meadow. 6-year-old Dennis Martin slipped behind a bush, planning to jump out and surprise his father, but he never came back. In a matter of seconds, a playful prank became one of the most enduring mysteries of Appalachia. The Martin family was familiar with the Smokies. William Martin, Dennis's father, had hiked these trails many times before. That June, he brought his sons and their grandfather up to Spence Field, a grassy clearing high on the Appalachian Trail near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. It was the perfect place to celebrate Father's Day. Fresh air, wide skies, and miles of forest to explore. As luck would have it, another family named Martin, unrelated but friendly, had also come to the same spot. The children bonded instantly, chasing each other through the clearing, their voices echoing through the trees. It was a game of mischief that set the tragedy in motion. The boys decided to split up, hide, and leap out to startle the adults when they returned along the trail. Dennis, the youngest, took his own path into the brush. His brother and the other boys rushed to their hiding places, giggling with anticipation. Within minutes, the older children reappeared, laughing at their successful prank, but Dennis never emerged. At first, his father thought the boy was simply waiting for the perfect moment. 10 minutes passed, then 20. William Martin called his son's name, the edge in his voice sharpening as the silence deepened. Then panic hit. He tore into the trees, shouting, searching. There was nothing. The search that followed became one of the largest in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Rangers, National Guard troops, and eventually more than 1,400 volunteers joined the effort. Helicopters circled overhead, loudspeakers calling Dennis's name. Dog teams sniffed along ravines and creeks. Volunteers formed tight lines, sweeping through the underbrush, combing mile after mile of rugged terrain. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single trace of the boy. But the silence of the woods was not empty. Strange details filtered back from the search. Investigators reported child-sized footprints near a creek bed, which suddenly stopped as if erased by water. A family camping miles away claimed they had heard a scream that afternoon, sharp, terrified, echoing through the trees. Another man described seeing a ragged, unkempt figure running through the forest, something slung over his shoulder. None of it could be proven, but each piece only deepened the unease. For weeks, the Martins waited. William Martin scoured the ridges himself, sleepless, haunted by guilt. The official search dwindled as the summer wore on. By September, efforts were suspended. The mountains had given nothing back. Dennis Martin had simply vanished. His case remained open, but with each passing year, hope dimmed. Speculation never stopped. Some believed Dennis had wandered too far and fallen into one of the Smokies' countless ravines, his body hidden by rocks and undergrowth. Others argued he could have drowned in the rushing creeks that cut through the valleys, but many clung to darker theories. Was Dennis taken by a stranger, the disheveled man reported in the area? Could he have been abducted and carried far from the trail before searchers arrived? Some even whispered older Appalachian fears, that the mountains themselves sometimes claimed people, as if the wilderness had hungers no one understood. For Dennis's family, there was only pain. His father returned to Spencefield for years afterward, wandering the same meadows and trails hoping for any sign. He never found one. To this day, Dennis Martin's disappearance is one of the most famous mysteries in the national park system. What makes it so chilling is not what was found, but what was not. The Smoky Mountains are vast, but even vastness rarely hides all traces. Here there were no answers, just silence stretching over decades. Parents tell the story as a warning. Don't stray too far, don't vanish into the trees. Rangers tell it as a lesson. No matter how peaceful a meadow looks, danger lies close. And in Greenbrier and Gatlinburg, locals retell it as a wound in the history of the mountains. A reminder that in Appalachia, sometimes the forest doesn't give back what it takes. Zona Heaster's ghost had spoken to bring justice. Dennis Martin left nothing, no body, no voice, no trace. The contrast between the two stories shows the cruel spectrum of Appalachian horror. Sometimes the dead return to speak, and sometimes they leave behind only silence. But silence isn't always the end. Sometimes the horror is human, deliberate, and it walks the same trails as the innocent. Just 12 years after Dennis disappeared, two young hikers on the Appalachian Trail would meet a predator who made the forest his hunting ground. Their names were Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey, and their story is next. And if these stories keep you listening, don't forget to subscribe, because the mountains hold more darkness than most dare to imagine. It was May of 1981, springtime on the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. For most hikers, the trail was a promise of peace and solitude, a chance to test themselves against the wilderness. For two young social workers from Maine, Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Ramsey, it was supposed to be an adventure of purpose, hiking to raise funds for the mentally ill. They were 27 years old, full of optimism, and they had no reason to believe the forest would hold anything but quiet beauty. What they found instead was a predator waiting in the trees, and their story became one of the darkest chapters in the history of the trail. Robert and Laura were both compassionate souls, dedicated to helping those in need. They took their mission onto the Appalachian Trail with high spirits, moving steadily south through Virginia. They stopped at the Wapiti Shelter, a simple wooden structure tucked into the dense woods near Parisburg. Hikers had passed through shelters like this for decades. They were places of rest and camaraderie, not of danger. But that night, the woods were different. Lurking nearby was Randall Lee Smith, a man whose life had unraveled long before. He grew up in the area but was known as a drifter, a loner, someone who never quite belonged. He had a reputation for being odd, even unsettling. And whether it was opportunity, resentment, or something darker, on that May evening, Smith turned violent. Days later, searchers discovered Robert and Laura's bodies not far from the shelter. Robert had been shot, Laura had been stabbed again and again, her body left partially buried under leaves. Their deaths shocked the hiking community. The Appalachian Trail was supposed to be safe, a place where strangers could trust one another in the wilderness. Suddenly, that trust was shattered. Investigators pieced the crime together slowly. Smith's fingerprint was found on a paperback novel that belonged to Laura. Witnesses had seen him near the shelter around the time of the murders. He was arrested, and facing overwhelming evidence, he accepted a plea bargain, 2 counts of second-degree murder. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he received 2 concurrent 15-year sentences. Many hikers and families of the victims felt betrayed by the leniency. How could such brutality be punished with so little time? Smith entered prison, and for a time it seemed justice, however incomplete, had been done. But 15 years later, in 1996, he was released. He returned to Giles County, to the same mountains where he had killed before. Locals were uneasy. The man who had once made the Appalachian Trail his hunting ground was back, walking free. For 12 years he lived quietly, or at least quietly enough not to draw attention. Then in May of 2008, almost exactly 27 years after the original murders, Smith struck again. 2 fishermen, Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston, were camping near Dismal Creek, just a mile or 2 from where Robert and Laura had died. Smith approached them, asking for food, sharing their campfire. He ate dinner with them, spoke casually, even seemed friendly. But as the night wore on, he pulled a gun and opened fire. Both men were shot, but miraculously both survived. Bleeding and terrified, they managed to escape and alert authorities. A manhunt followed, and Smith fled in a stolen truck. He crashed while trying to escape, and not long after, he was captured. Within days, he died in custody, closing the book on his life of violence. The symmetry of his crimes chills even now. His second attack happened in the same stretch of forest where he had first murdered hikers decades earlier. It was as though the trail itself was cursed, or as though Smith could not escape the darkness he had left there. The Appalachian Trail, meant to symbolize endurance and freedom, became instead the backdrop for a cycle of brutality. For hikers, the story of Randall Lee Smith is more than a true crime tale. It is a reminder that the wilderness, however majestic, cannot protect you from human evil. The forest may conceal, but it is men like Smith who turn isolation into opportunity. The horror lies not in the mountains themselves, but in what can walk them unseen. What makes the case endure is the way it blurred the line between justice and fate. A killer who should never have walked free was released, and he returned to the same woods to commit the same crime. Robert and Laura's families never received the closure they deserved. Farmer and Johnston carried their wounds as proof that Smith's violence had never ended. The Appalachian Trail carries it too, an invisible scar stretching across Virginia's ridges. Zona Heaster's ghost had spoken from the grave. Dennis Martin had vanished into silence. With Randall Smith, the horror was unmistakably human. A predator who lived among the hikers, a man who turned the symbol of freedom into his hunting ground. And yet, even this story was not the last. The trail's shadows only deepened. Less than a decade later in Pennsylvania, another young couple set out to hike, unaware that their shelter in the woods would become their tomb. Their names were Jeffrey Hood and Molly LaRue, and their murders proved that the danger was not an isolated tragedy. It was a darkness that kept returning to the Appalachian Trail. If you're still with me, make sure to subscribe, because the next story is even more brutal, and it shows just how far human violence can reach, even in the quiet of the mountains. It was September 1990, the Appalachian Trail winding through Pennsylvania, when 2 young hikers pitched camp near a rustic shelter. Their names were Jeffrey Hood and Molly LaRue. Both were 26, full of energy and deeply in love. They had met through their work helping troubled youth in Tennessee, and the trail had become their grand adventure. To them, the forest was a place of freedom, where every mile was a promise. But in the quiet of that night, beneath the shelter's rough roof, their journey ended in a storm of cruelty. What happened to Jeffrey and Molly still echoes along the trail, Proof that the greatest danger in the wilderness is sometimes not the wild itself, but the stranger who walks beside you. They had been hiking since the summer, making steady progress northward. Friends described them as idealists, the kind of people who believed they could change the world one act of kindness at a time. The Appalachian Trail was their escape, their challenge, their shared passion. On September 13th, they stopped at a spot near Duncannon, Pennsylvania, where shelters offered basic refuge for hikers. It should have been nothing more than another quiet night in the woods, but another man was nearby. His name was Paul David Cruz, a drifter who had fallen into the shadows of society. Cruz carried bitterness and violence with him, and in the stillness of the Pennsylvania woods he found two innocent people who could not have guessed what he was capable of. The attack was brutal. Jeffrey was shot 3 times in the chest. Molly was restrained, assaulted, and stabbed repeatedly in the back and throat. Their lives ended not with warning, not with chance to escape, but in the kind of cruelty that strips the wilderness of its peace. For a day the trail was silent, their absence unknown. Then hikers passing through found signs, blood, belongings, and soon after their bodies hidden near the shelter. The news shook the hiking community. In the 1980s and 90s, the trail had grown into a symbol of exploration, a place where strangers offered food and camaraderie, where hikers shared trust more readily than suspicion. The murders of Jeffrey and Molly shattered that trust. Suddenly the trail felt unsafe, its romance broken by violence. The manhunt began quickly. Cruz had tried to cover his tracks, even wearing Jeffrey's gear and taking his backpack. But hikers noticed something odd. An unfamiliar man struggling under equipment too large for him, acting out of place. Volunteers reported him. Within 8 days, authorities tracked him down. DNA evidence tied him directly to the crime. He was arrested, tried, and eventually sentenced to life without parole. For those who loved Jeffrey and Molly, justice brought little comfort. Their friends remembered them as people with so much life ahead, stolen in an instant. Their families mourned not only the loss, but the manner of it. The Appalachian Trail community carried the scar. Where once there was an almost naive trust, there was now caution, fear, a reminder that even here, evil could find its way. The story of Jeffrey Hood and Molly LaRue is not just a crime story, it is a turning point. It marked the Appalachian Trail as a place where innocence and idealism could be shattered, where the intimacy of camping together could become a vulnerability. Their deaths forced hikers to face the truth that the dangers of the trail were not only storms, snakes, or exhaustion. They were also human. There is a quiet cruelty in their story, unlike the mystery of Dennis Martin or the supernatural justice of Zona Heaster. This was raw, human violence, committed by a man who might have been passed without a second glance on a highway or a street corner. Cruz carried that violence into the woods and left 2 bodies in his wake. And while justice came swiftly, it did nothing to erase the sense of violation the community felt. Jeffrey and Molly had believed the trail was a sanctuary. After their deaths, that illusion was gone. What lingered was the knowledge that the wilderness is never truly separate from the world beyond. Where people go, so too can cruelty follow. Their story stands beside that of Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey, and it forms a grim pattern. The Appalachian Trail as both escape and hunting ground. The rhythm of the trail is beautiful, yes, but broken by the footsteps of predators who see vulnerability in the trust of hikers. Jeffrey and Molly never suspected, never prepared for such a possibility. That is what makes their story so devastating. And yet the Appalachian Trail continued to draw new dreamers. Even after their deaths, people kept walking the ridges and valleys. Some hiked in memory, others in defiance of fear. But violence would strike again. Less than 2 decades later, in the foothills of Georgia, a young woman named Meredith Emerson set out for a hike with her dog. She was bright, strong, and cautious, but she too would meet a predator in the woods. If you've followed Jeffrey and Molly's tragic story, stay with me. Subscribe now, because the next chapter is as chilling as any, and it will show how even the most prepared hiker can fall victim to the darkness that lurks off the trail. It was the first week of January 2008. the Appalachian foothills of northern Georgia chilled by winter air, 24-year-old Meredith Emerson set out with her black Labrador Ella for a hike along Blood Mountain. She was bright, athletic, and familiar with the outdoors. Friends remembered her as cheerful, determined, someone who rarely let fear control her. That morning, she parked her car at the trailhead, tightened her boots, and disappeared into the woods. By evening, she had not returned, and by the time the truth emerged, her story had become one of the most terrifying reminders that even strength and caution cannot always protect against evil hiding in plain sight. Meredith had grown up in Colorado and moved to Georgia for work. Hiking was second nature to her, and she often brought Ella on her trips. On January 1st, she told her boyfriend she was heading out for a day hike. Witnesses later recalled seeing her on the trail with an older man. He was lean, gray-haired, dressed like any other hiker. Nothing about him seemed alarming at first. They walked within sight of each other, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. By afternoon, Meredith and Ella had vanished from the public eye. When Meredith failed to return home, her friends and family panicked. They knew she was cautious, the type who planned her hikes carefully. Her car was found parked at Vogel State Park, but there was no trace of her inside. The first sliver of hope came when Ella was discovered wandering in a parking lot miles away, dirty, thirsty, but alive. Searchers scoured the mountain, calling her name, finding scraps of evidence. Blood on the ground, a discarded water bottle, then more unsettling signs: her ID, her phone, her jacket, abandoned along trails as though dropped in haste. Investigators soon focused on the man seen with her. His name was Gary Michael Hilton, a 61-year-old drifter who had haunted the forests of Georgia for years. Locals knew him vaguely. He was eccentric, often asking hikers for help or food, sometimes sleeping in his van. Few had imagined what he was capable of, but evidence built quickly. Witnesses placed him near Meredith. Surveillance cameras caught him trying to use her bank cards, and his van, when searched, revealed bloodstains and traces of her belongings. The story of what happened next is almost too cruel to imagine. According to prosecutors, Hilton held Meredith captive for several days, forcing her to attempt to withdraw money for him. When she refused to give him her PIN, he grew enraged. Eventually, he killed her and decapitated her body in a desperate attempt to hide her identity. On January 7th, guided by his own confession as part of a plea deal, investigators found her remains hidden in Dawson Forest. For her family and friends, the discovery was devastating. Meredith had been known for her resilience, her kindness, her independence. To lose her in such a way seemed unbearable. The hiking community was shaken to its core. Blood Mountain was a popular trail, not a remote corner of the wilderness. If such violence could happen there, it could happen anywhere. Hilton was sentenced to life in prison for Meredith's murder, with no chance of parole for 30 years. But her death was not an isolated act. Hilton was later linked to other murders of hikers in Florida and North Carolina. He had used the forests as his hunting grounds, moving among unsuspecting walkers, choosing his moments. He turned the very thing hikers sought, solitude, escape, into vulnerability. Meredith's story lingers because she did everything right. She was experienced, she had her dog with her, she was hiking in daylight on a well-traveled trail, and still it was not enough. The Appalachian wilderness can hide storms, predators, accidents, but the most dangerous predator of all is human. Hilton was not a phantom, not a legend, not a ghost. He was a man with a face that could blend into the crowd, a man who smiled and asked for help, then struck when the opportunity came. For many who heard her story, the terror lies not only in her suffering but in the ordinariness of it. She could have been anyone, any hiker, any daughter, any friend who chose the trail that day. The lesson the mountains whispered after her death was harsh. Trust should be rationed. Vigilance never dropped, because evil does not always announce itself with fangs or claws. Sometimes it carries a backpack and walks beside you. Meredith Emerson's name is now spoken as both a warning and a memory. Her family worked to preserve her legacy, remembering her as a vibrant young woman who deserved more than to be defined by her final moments. Ella, The loyal dog who survived became a symbol of the bond she carried with her. For the hikers who continue to climb Blood Mountain, the silence of the trail is heavier now. It carries her story like an echo, from the ghost who testified in Greenbrier, to the boy who vanished in the Smokies, to the trail murders in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and finally to Meredith's last hike in Georgia. We've followed more than a century of Appalachian horror, but these mountains are older than all of those stories, and their shadows hold patterns that repeat. Sometimes people don't just die here, they vanish entirely. And not once, not twice, but again and again in the same cursed stretch of wilderness. Our next story takes us to Vermont, at the northern edge of the Appalachians, where between 1945 and 1950, 5 people disappeared in what came to be known as the Bennington Triangle. None of them were ever seen again. If you're still walking these dark trails with me, subscribe now because the mysteries only grow deeper from here. It was late 1945 in the hills of Vermont, where the northern reaches of the Appalachian Mountains stretch into dense forests and lonely valleys. The region was rugged and beautiful, but in the span of just 5 years it gained a reputation that endures even now. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people vanished in a patch of wilderness so mysteriously that locals began to call it cursed. They named it the Bennington Triangle, and to this day no trace of the missing has ever been found. The first to disappear was an experienced woodsman named Mitty Rivers. It was November 12, 1945, when Rivers, a 74-year-old guide, led a hunting party of 4 into the mountains near Glastonbury, Vermont. He knew the land better than most, moving ahead of the group along a familiar trail. At some point he slipped out of sight around a bend. The others followed minutes later, but Rivers was gone. They expected to find him at camp, but he never arrived. Search teams scoured the hills, hundreds of people combing the forest for weeks. Only one thing was ever discovered: a single rifle cartridge in a stream. Rivers himself had vanished, leaving no tracks, no body, nothing but silence. Just a year later, the most famous disappearance struck. On December 1, 1946, Paula Jean Weldon, an 18-year-old college student at Bennington College, set off for a hike along the long trail. She wore a bright red coat, easy to spot against the winter trees. Witnesses saw her walking confidently toward the trailhead. A few hikers even passed her on the path, but when she failed to return to campus that night, panic set in. The search for Paula was massive. Local police, hundreds of volunteers, even the FBI joined in. They brought in planes, bloodhounds, every resource available, yet no trace was found. No footprints beyond the trail, no clothing, no body. Paula had walked into the woods and simply never come back. Her case rattled Vermont. She was young, vibrant, from a good family. Newspapers across the state covered the mystery. Her disappearance even sparked political action. Vermont created its own state police force soon afterward, frustrated with how the investigation had been handled. But despite the attention, Paula was never found. Theories abounded. Perhaps she ran away, perhaps she was murdered, perhaps she fell into a ravine. Others whispered stranger explanations, that the mountains themselves had taken her. By 1949, the Triangle claimed another. James Tedford, a veteran and resident of a local soldiers' home, boarded a bus bound for Bennington after visiting relatives. Witnesses remembered him sitting near the window as the bus wound through the Green Mountains. But when the bus pulled into its stop, Tedford was gone. His luggage remained in the overhead rack, his timetable and ticket still tucked in his pocket on the seat. Every passenger sworn to having seen him on board. Somehow, between one stop and the next, James Tedford had disappeared into thin air. The very next year, in October 1950, 8-year-old Paul Jepson climbed into his mother's truck while she tended animals at the family dump. When she returned minutes later, Paul was gone. His tiny footprints led a short way into the brush, then ended abruptly. Searchers called his name for days. Bloodhounds tracked his scent to a nearby road, but nothing more. The child was never seen again. Only weeks later in the same year came the final disappearance in the cluster. 53-year-old Frida Langer, an experienced hiker and camper, set out with her cousin on a short hike near Somerset Reservoir. She slipped on a rock and fell into a stream. Laughing it off, she told her cousin she'd run back to camp to change clothes. She never returned. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 400 people searched the area on foot, horseback, and by helicopter. Nothing turned up. Months later, in May of 1951, her body was discovered in an open area that had already been searched extensively. The remains were too decomposed to determine cause of death. No answers came. 5 disappearances, all within a 35-mile radius in less than 5 years. Hunters, a college student, a veteran, a child, a seasoned hiker, none connected yet bound together by the same cruel geography. Some believed the wilderness itself was to blame: steep gullies, sudden weather, the unforgiving vastness of the Green Mountains. Others whispered about a serial predator, someone who hunted in those hills. Still others leaned on folklore: strange energies, curses, the land itself reclaiming the lost. To this day, the Bennington Triangle remains one of New England's most enduring mysteries. No conclusive evidence has ever explained the vanishings. Tourists visit Glastonbury for ghost tours. Psychics claim the land is a window into another world, and skeptics still argue that the rugged terrain is explanation enough. Yet the silence where Paula walked into the trees, where Paul's small footsteps ended, where Tedford vanished from his bus seat, still chills anyone who studies the case. The Greenbrier Ghost spoke from beyond to expose her killer. Dennis Martin left no sound at all. Randall Smith and Paul Cruz revealed the human face of evil. Meredith Emerson showed how even experience couldn't save her from a predator. And in Vermont, the Bennington Triangle reminded everyone that sometimes people simply vanish, swallowed whole by the mountains, leaving no trace but the echo of their names. But disappearances aren't the only strange phenomenon in Appalachia. In North Carolina, on clear nights, mysterious orbs of light drift above the ridges of Brown Mountain. Locals say they are the spirits of those lost forever in the hills, searching for their way home. Skeptics say it's just science. Our next story asks, what do you believe? If you've stayed this long, don't forget to subscribe, because the mountains are only getting stranger. On clear nights in the foothills of North Carolina, locals sometimes stop their cars along winding mountain roads, switch off the headlights, and wait. If they're lucky, or unlucky depending on how you see it, they'll witness it: glowing orbs drifting above the ridges of Brown Mountain. The lights appear in shades of white, orange, or blue, hovering and darting like restless spirits. They've been seen for centuries, by Cherokee hunters, Civil War soldiers, farmers, and now tourists with cameras. Some say they are nothing but natural gas, reflections, or science yet unexplained. But in Appalachia, where every shadow carries a story, people believe the Brown Mountain lights are the souls of the lost, wanderers who never found their way home. The first written reports go back to 1771, when a German engineer named John William Gerard de Bram described mysterious fiery vapors rising above the ridges. Long before that, the Cherokee told of battles fought in those hills, of warriors slain and their spirits carrying torches in the afterlife. Settlers repeated their own tales, strange lights that moved with purpose as though searching. During the Civil War, soldiers camped nearby reported seeing columns of glowing orbs gliding silently through the valleys, too steady to be fireflies, too bright to be lanterns. By the early 1900s, the phenomenon became so widely known that newspapers across the South sent reporters to investigate. In 1913, a flood of letters described sightings so consistent that the U.S. Geological Survey dispatched scientists to study the matter. They blamed reflections of headlights and train lamps, though locals scoffed. The lights had been reported long before cars or trains ever reached the valley. Even today, skeptics point to marsh gas, mirages, or distant brush fires, but none of the theories fully explain why the orbs move in strange patterns, rising and falling, darting across the ridgeline. For the people who lived near Brown Mountain, science was never the point. Stories grew with every generation. Some swore the lights followed travelers, appearing just beyond reach. Others said hunters who disappeared in the forest returned as glowing orbs. their restless souls carrying ghostly lanterns. Families told of miners lost in cave-ins, their spirits wandering forever, their lanterns flickering across the mountainside. In a region scarred by disappearances like the Bennington Triangle or the Smoky Mountain mysteries, it made sense to believe the lights were tied to human souls. Witness accounts describe moments that defy easy dismissal. Campers have watched orbs hover just yards away, pulsing as though alive, then vanish into the trees. Couples have parked along overlooks only to see a line of glowing spheres floating together like a procession, weaving silently along the ridges. Photographs exist, blurry and imperfect, but enough to show lights where no roads or houses exist. Scientists argue, locals shake their heads, and the lights keep appearing night after night. What makes the Brown Mountain Lights terrifying isn't only their mystery, but the feeling they bring. Witnesses often describe sudden chills, the sensation of being watched, or an overwhelming sadness as though standing among unseen crowds. Some say if you call out the name of someone lost in those hills, the lights will answer, flickering in acknowledgement. Others whisper warnings. Follow them and you may never return. The lights have become part of North Carolina's folklore, a tourist attraction even, with overlooks built for viewing. But ask the locals quietly, and you'll hear stories they don't tell outsiders. Stories of hikers who chased the lights into the woods and never came back. Stories of families who saw a familiar figure in the glow, only to realize that person had died years before. Stories of orbs floating low over cabins, peering through windows as if searching for someone. The truth? No one knows. Perhaps it's geology. Perhaps it's spirits. Perhaps it's something no one has words for yet. But what makes the Brown Mountain Lights endure is how they weave together history, folklore, and fear. They remind everyone who looks up at the ridges that Appalachia is not just mountains and rivers, but a place where the natural and the supernatural blur. We've heard of the Greenbrier Ghost, of children who vanish, of hikers hunted by killers. But the Brown Mountain Lights are something else. Not human cruelty, not tragic silence, but a mystery that moves on its own, glowing and alive. A phenomenon that makes you wonder if the lost ever really leave. And yet, as chilling as lights in the sky can be, Appalachia holds darker stories rooted in fire and suffering. In the 1930s, in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, a small jail caught fire. Prisoners screamed behind locked doors as flames consumed the cells. The building collapsed, but locals swore that long after the ashes cooled, the cries of the inmates echoed through the night. Our final story takes us there, to the ruins of the Greenbrier Jail, where even today people claim the dead never stopped begging for release. If the thought of wandering lights unsettles you, make sure to subscribe, because the last tale of this series brings us back to where fire and death left voices that still haunt the night. It was a bitter winter night in the 1930s when the small jailhouse of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, caught fire. The building was old, its stone walls sturdy but its wooden interior dry as tinder. Inside, a handful of prisoners were locked in their cells. When the flames began to spread, their screams pierced the cold air. Guards and townsfolk rushed to the site, but the heat was overwhelming and the iron bars held firm. One by one, the voices fell silent as the fire consumed the jail. By dawn, the structure was a blackened ruin, and the charred remains of the inmates lay within. Official reports blamed faulty wiring. Others said a kerosene lamp had been knocked over. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a building full of men who never had a chance to escape. Their deaths might have been forgotten as one more Appalachian tragedy, were it not for what came after. Because in Greenbrier, people began to whisper that the fire had not truly ended. Neighbors claimed that on still nights a faint smell of smoke drifted across the empty lot where the jail once stood. Hunters passing by reported hearing voices, hoarse, desperate cries rising from the darkness as though the prisoners were still begging to be freed. Some said they saw shapes moving through the ruins, shadows twisting in the firelight that no longer burned. One woman walking home from church swore she heard the clang of iron bars and the sound of fists pounding metal. When she looked, the jailhouse was nothing but rubble. Over the decades, the legends grew. Local teenagers dared each other to approach the site at night. They came back pale, claiming they had heard voices whispering their names. Others told of glowing figures behind invisible bars, pressed against the air as though still trapped. Ministers warned people not to mock the dead. Lawmen admitted off the record that they avoided the ruins after dark. Some explained the haunting as guilt. The guards had tried but failed to save the men inside. The town, powerless to help, carried the memory of their screams. That kind of collective trauma can linger, replayed in the mind until it feels like it never stopped. But many in Greenbrier insisted it wasn't memory, it was real. That the spirits of those inmates were trapped, just as their bodies had been, bound to the spot where fire took their last breath. Even now, people who visit Greenbrier's hills speak of the place. They say the ruins are gone, yet the cries remain. That sometimes when the night is too quiet, you can still hear the echo of men dying in the flames, their voices carried on the wind. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, it is hard to ignore the weight that hangs over that ground. A reminder that the mountains never forget tragedy, that Appalachia records every scream, every loss, and sometimes plays it back. From Zona Heaster's ghost in 1897, to Dennis Martin's disappearance in 1969, to the hikers murdered on the trail, to the brown mountain lights drifting across North Carolina skies, these 8 stories are more than folklore. They are a shadow history of Appalachia, where human cruelty, unexplained vanishings, and restless spirits form a chain stretching across generations. Each story different, yet bound by the same mountains, the same silence, the same haunting sense that here, the past never stays buried. You've just heard 8 true Appalachian horror stories, each darker than the last. If you felt the weight of these mountains tonight, know this: there are more stories waiting, deeper in the hollows, hidden on old maps, whispered in towns you've never heard of. So if you don't want to miss what comes next, make sure to subscribe. It's the best way to keep walking these dark trails with us. In the next videos, we'll travel further, into ghost towns where voices linger, into dispatch logs from frozen Alaskan nights, into the depths of the sea where cruise ships carry secrets they'd rather forget. The mountains have spoken, but the shadows are not done yet.